Here's what I plan to talk about. Firstly, I'll say a little about the project undertaken by the Society's Civic Environment Committee to create an atlas and directory of the parks and open spaces in the city, as that's what led on to the idea for this talk. I'm not going to go into detail about the history of every single site, so I'll then refer to some of the main sources that you can use if you want to find out more. I'll then talk about some of the different ways that today's parks and open spaces have come to their present situation and refer to a few sites in more detail. In some cases, there's evidence on the ground of what went before, and I'll give some examples. And then to finish, I'll mention a couple of sites where there are likely to be new opportunities for public visits in the future. Norwich has a great variety of parks and open spaces. The Society's Civic Environment Committee decided to create an atlas and directory of them all. To carry out that project, we researched what existing information there was and then went out exploring on foot. All of us who did the work would consider themselves to be long-term residents of the city, so we were all pleasantly surprised to discover how many sites there were that were new to us. Initially, we restricted ourselves to sites within the City Council boundary, but we were encouraged during the project to look at one that was just outside that we were unfamiliar with, and that's Charter Wood. And having decided to include that, we also included another site right on the boundary, the much better known Catton Park. We recorded over 100 sites, and the results are in the atlas and directory that's available on the Society's website. Just to give you a flavour of what we covered, there are well-known sites such as Eaton Park and Mousehold Heath, and lesser-known ones such as Heartsease Playing Field and Pointers Field. They range from riverside meadows and walks along to steeper areas with fine views, and there are a number of sites with historic features. And there are 11 areas listed by Historic England as parks or gardens of national significance. I should say at this point that although our atlas and directory includes the two cemetery sites shown here, Earlham and Rosary, as well as churchyards, I'm not going to be talking about the history of churchyards and cemeteries. That's definitely a talk for another day and another speaker. And we recorded details of voluntary groups who helped look after sites where those were evident on the ground. And you'll be hearing more about some of all of these sites that I've mentioned. Going on to the sources that I found useful, the first is information I've gathered during the committee's project, including information that's available on site. From information I've learnt serving as the Mousehold Heath conservator appointed by the Society, and from being involved with the Friends of Ketts Heights. The Society's own publications that are relevant include The Captain and the Norwich Parks, which isn't currently in print but is likely to be available here in the library, and of course Aspects of Norwich, which is about to celebrate its 5th anniversary. The most recent edition featured the Heavenly Gardens project that George Ishmael is leading for the Historic Churches Trust, and other articles have been on the Plantation Garden, Chapelfield Gardens and Catton Park. Geoffrey Goreham was a prolific writer and, I imagine, would have been a regular contributor to these talks if they'd been happening when he was active. In particular, he wrote a work on the parks and open spaces of Norwich in the early 1960s. So far as I'm aware, this was not published in printed form, but a typescript version is available in the Heritage Centre library upstairs. And on the right there, you see a picture of him in one of his many capacities, and that's when he was Sheriff of Norwich. The Norfolk Gardens Trust's journal regularly features sites past and present in the city. For example, this article on the adaptation of churchyards. The Trust has made available a number of past copies of the journal to read on its website if you're not a member, and this article can be seen there. The Trust's Enticing Paths book contains extended and well-illustrated versions of past articles, including chapters on the pleasure gardens of Norwich, the Bishop's Garden, the War Memorial Gardens, and the Carrow House and Abbey site. Nature in Norwich was published by the City Council in about 1996, and again it's available in the library for reference. It contains a lot of useful information about the history and natural history of sites in and around the city. There are also some more general reference sources which are of interest and possible use. These include the Historic Towns Trust's British Historic Towns Atlas. A map of Norwich has been made available on the Trust website and is a fascinating resource. And there's an extract from it for the area that we're around, looking in more detail. The National Library of Scotland has digitised many old Ordnance Survey maps and georeferenced them, which means that they can be matched up with modern day mapping to make comparisons. And to give an example of how these might be useful, here are close-up views from those two sources of the area where we are today. And you'll see, for example, that the Forum site once accommodated a lane called Swan Lane. Another fascinating site is Historic England's Aerial Photo Explorer, which was expanded from the Aerofilms archive to include wartime aerial photography, among others. You'll see that it includes over 400,000 digitised photographs, so the potential to be distracted when using it is immense. There's also material available in the Heritage Centre upstairs here and in the Norfolk Record Office. There's also Clive Lloyd's Colonel Unthank's Norwich website, which has a category on Norwich parks, well worth reading. I'll start looking at the history with this 1947 plan published by the Council. It's worth noting the absence of what we use today, riverside, walks and former railway line paths, but also the extent of bowling greens, even in small sites such as Gildencroft and James Stewart Garden, as well as in the larger parks. But today, the former bowling area in Waterloo Park is being converted by the Friends there into a wildflower meadow, so things do change. The only site that we can really count as a designed park is Catton Park, one of Humphrey Repton's earliest commissions, and restored in recent years thanks to the efforts of the local community. The adjacent area of Fiddlewood Plantation, which is now inside the Norwich city boundary, is reckoned to have been planted as part of the estate plan. Earlham Park was much less of a formally designed park, more of a large estate attached to the hall, which is now occupied by the university and can be visited on Heritage Open Day tours. The whole estate was purchased by the city in the 1920s, and Park was then made into a municipal golf course. In turn, that was offered in the 1950s as the site for the new university, and after consideration of alternative locations, such as Eton Golf Course, the proposal went ahead. Today, of course, the UEA campus, with the Broad that was created there, is a popular place to visit. On the opposite side of the city is Lion Wood. This was also acquired by the city as part of a wider estate, in this case the Harvey estate centred on Mousehold House, one of the city's lesser-known listed buildings. Geoffrey Goreham lived in the then near derelict house for 3 years, while councillors deliberated on its future, and not surprisingly, he wrote about the experience in a work. But be warned, it contains more descriptions of council committee meetings than most will want to read. Some sites came into the possession of the City Council as a consequence of donation. Woodlands Park off the Dereham Road was given in 1904 by Mrs. Pym, daughter of the owner of Woodlands on the other side of Dereham Road, who had acquired it as a playground for his children. The James Stewart Garden off Recorder Road was given in his memory by his widow, who perhaps deserves her own recognition as having been the first female councillor in the city. east, Woodrow Pilling Park, or Pilling Park as it's more commonly known today, and on the other side of Mousehold House from Lion Wood, was also a gift, this time in memory of Jeremiah Woodrow, who had left Norwich in 1829 to become a northern industrialist. His daughter, Mrs. Pilling, gave the land to the city, and the park was officially opened in 1929. Many of these early acquisitions or donations had support from the Norwich Playing Fields and Open Spaces Society. For example, it assisted with making Woodlands Park suitable for public use in 1904. The Society was also instrumental in encouraging and helping the Council to acquire the land for Waterloo Park and Eaton Park. As I noted earlier, back in 1947, the Council's plan of parks didn't show the linear routes available today as Lakenham Way and Marriott's Way, and both for the very good reason that they were still in use as railway lines. It's not just old railway lines that have been converted for use as open spaces. Danby Wood is on the site of a former chalk pit that has associated lime kilns. There are also sites on the riverside walk through the city which show no evidence of their former use, perhaps most spectacularly in the case of the St Martin's Gasworks, now replaced by the law courts with an adjacent riverside walk. And school and library sites have in part also been opened up as public open space, from Henderson Park in the west of the city to Old Library Wood, which is just across the road from Thorpe Railway Station. Some of the riverside areas under the control of the City Council still have vestiges of their former agricultural use, in that there is still grazing as part of the management of the areas. So if you go to Marston Marshes or Eaton Common, don't be surprised to encounter cattle. Some parks and open spaces were developed with the development of adjoining estates. The Heartsease estate on the east side of the city was provided in the 1960s with Alderman Walker Park and a large playing field area next to the tower blocks. Mile Cross Gardens were created as part of the development of that estate, and the estate now known as the Pilling Park Estate was established around the same time as the park was created, and indeed took its name from the park. Looking at a few sites in more detail, some of the city's best known parks are collectively referred to as the Captain's Parks, and this title refers to the remodelling carried out in the 1920s and 30s under the direction of the then park superintendent, Captain Sands Winch. These schemes were part of a programme of unemployment relief, funded at least in part from central government. However, the parks were not on newly acquired land, but on park sites that had been purchased some years earlier. For example, you'll see there that Eaton Park the land was originally acquired in 1906, but it was only in 1928, after the remodelling under the captain's direction, that it took the form that we see today. Charter Wood's an interesting case. It's not actually within the city boundary, but just outside, on the western side of Bowthorpe. It is a relatively recent creation, having been established to mark the 800th anniversary in 1994 of the granting of a charter to city, hence the name given to the wood. But what the future holds for it is less certain, as an area which includes it is potentially going to be designated for housing development, and that's the area north of where you see it on the map there. Where the theatre and assembly house are now was once the site of St Mary's Chapel and Ecclesiastical College. Land to the west was known as Chapel Croft and later Chapel Field, and for over 60 years, mainly in the early 19th century, there was a reservoir there to supply water to the city. But in 1854, that use ceased and the land was acquired by the corporation, being formally converted into a public park for an opening in 1880. Later use included as a site for public air raid shelters, and it remains a popular park today. Ketts Heights has 5 distinct periods of history. The first was the building of a chapel at the same time as the development of the cathedral site due west, and you can just see the cathedral spire in the image there. The chapel was associated with the nearby St Leonard's Priory, which is at the top of what is now Gas Hill. The next stage was the use of the by now deconsecrated chapel as the headquarters for Ketts Rebellion in 1549. We don't have any contemporary images of Ketts Rebellion, but what we do have here is an image of the Common Lot's staging of their play about the rebellion on Ketts Heights a few years ago. There was then a stage when it was a place of popular resort for artists, and you can see this image in the Bridewell Museum, and that remained part of Mousehold Heath until enclosure in 1800. And it was not long after that that most of the land was acquired by the gasworks, which was being established at the bottom of the slope down by Bishopbridge, and later developed for use by the gas workers with terraces and gardens and greenhouses. And then the final stage was the handing over of the site by way of donation to the City Council in the 1970s, when the Gas Board no longer had any use for it. And again, after remodelling and indeed some job creation scheme, Manpower Services Commission, opening as a public open space, which has remained today. Historically, Mousehold Heath was a very extensive area of common land on the east side of the city, and Faden's map, published just before much enclosure of common land, gives a good indication. This is the original map, and this is the digital drawing by Andrew McNair, which makes the extent of the heath clearer. You see it shown in sort of yellowy orange colour. Geoffrey Goreham, who among his other roles was a Mousehold Heath conservator, wrote a short guide about Mousehold, which includes this plan, and that shows clearly how small a part the area today under the management of the conservators, which is in red outlined on the left there, in that aerial photography, forms of the former wider heath, which went right out into the countryside. How did that change come about? Well, among all the parishes that the former Mousehold Heath covered, there was one, Pockthorpe, where the heath wasn't subject to an Enclosure Act and award. That left 184 acres of remaining heathland, and what should happen to that was a matter of great contention between the City Council, which wanted to turn it into a public park, and the people of Pockthorpe, who were making a lot of use of it for example, digging pits for getting clay out for brick making, and considered they had rights, and indeed considered that they had acquired ownership of it. That all finished up in the courts and has been the subject of academic research. It's a very interesting paper here by Neil McMaster, which you can access in the journal Past and Present. And as part of this process, the council took powers in this Act of 1867, which in fact was mainly about creating the Whitlingham sewage works, put forward a scheme to appropriate the heath and use it for public recreation, with, as they say in the preamble, to great advantage to the inhabitants of Norwich. But it was not until 1886 that the heath, now under the control of the council, was opened as a public open space. In the early 20th century, a tram line along Bishopbridge Road was extended up Gurney Road, created by the council to run across the Heath. The trams ran in the summer and terminated by where the pavilion and fountain ground now are. So they're very much the centre of the Heath. A lot busier and a lot more covered in trees than shown in this rather attractive postcard. In the First World War, an extension to the tramway was made across the Heath to factories off what is now Salhouse Road to enable materials to be transported up from Thorpe railway station, and you can still walk that extension. Mousehold Heath is now managed by the Mousehold Heath Conservators, and they've been in existence since 1884. So I think there's a history project there with their 150th anniversary coming up in the not too distant future. Moving on to other evidence that can be seen on the ground, but firstly staying with Mousehold Heath, the earthworks that form the outer boundaries of St William's Chapel have been cleared of trees in recent years and an information panel erected. And if you go there, see if you can find the 4 corner boundary stones that mark the extent of the earthworks. And I've already mentioned St Michael's Chapel, one wall of which is still there to be seen on Ketts Heights. Just above King Street is a small green space, largely a play area, but containing the ruins of St Peter Southgate Church, taken down in the 1880s because it was in a dangerous state. It's intriguing that the map shows not only a tramway along King Street, but also a ferry across the river. And of course, at the time, there was no Novi Sad Bridge then, and Carrow Bridge was further away than it is today, which perhaps helps to explain why a ferry was viable. More examples are St Bartholomew Hale and St Benedict's, both victims of wartime bombing, and St Michael Bowthorpe, which has been a ruin rather longer. An intriguing find, if you can locate it in the woodland behind County Hall, is this arch, and it's a reconstruction of parts of the former cathedral infirmary, of which now only pillars remain in the car park by the hostelry there. I mentioned earlier that Henderson Park had been created on part of what was once the Bowthorpe school site. The running track in the park appears from this Ordnance Survey map of the 1950s to have once been the school running track. I also mentioned Danby Wood as a former quarry, and in this information panel on site, the cliffs formed by quarrying are marked in brown, so you can see they're quite extensive. But probably the best known of the Norwich open spaces that were once quarries is the Plantation Garden, where there's very much a sense of being in a hollowed out area. And the opposite is true of Ketts Heights, where the site that had been quarried had a level base that was ideal for the gasworks. The adjacent land that was too hilly to be used for gasworks is where the gardens were established. And the image on the left is from after the clearance of the gasworks, before the flats were built, when it was used as a car park, and it gives a good impression of the steepness of the sides. The aerial photo on the right was taken at the time the works were demolished, and I've added the line of Gas Hill, possibly the steepest hill in Norfolk, to give some perspective. It's not always easy to get a sense of height from an aerial photograph. So much for the past. What of the future? Norfolk Wildlife Trust has purchased Briar Marshes, land north of the river, south of Marriott's Way, and either side of Briar Road. The Trust's main aim will, of course, be nature conservation, but I would expect some additional public access. On the other side of the city is the East Norwich Strategic Regeneration Area. And the plans being drawn up will provide additional open space if they come to fruition. I've provided here links to the various sources and other references that I've made during the course of this talk.